Okay, so today we have a lot of things to talk about, so I might move a little bit fast. I'll try to get through it quickly. Please make sure you read the notes that accompany this. I write more about Surrealism and about particularly Degenerate Art than I talk about it in terms of the background. Okay, so first off, I want to give just kind of a brief shout out to Giorgio de Chirico and Pittura Metaphysica. So Pittura Metaphysica is the metaphysical art movement. It was pretty much just an Italian movement at the beginning of the 20th century, in the early 20th century. And the figures we most associate with it are De Chirico, who we have one of his works here, and also Carlo Cara. So these two artists were sort of ahead of their time, and a lot of the ideas behind the metaphysical art movement are very close to some of the ideas of Surrealism. So I just like to kind of give a brief wave to those guys for being one of the precursors to Surrealism, though they're a little before Surrealism proper actually happens. Yeah. So they're very focused on the depiction of dreams, which is one of the main sort of ingredients in Surrealism, which we will talk about now. Okay. These two guys are two of the writers who were extremely important in the foundations of Surrealism. Surrealism, like some other movements, begins as a literary movement. So here we have André Breton and Georges Bataille. I'm going to talk more about Breton, but if you want to get really into Surrealism, there's a big kind of division in 1929 between Breton and Bataille as far as the direction they each think that Surrealism should go, and it kind of splits the movement. We're going to focus more on Breton because that's where more of the visual artists follow, but it's very interesting. Georges Bataille is super interesting, bizarre guy. I studied him a lot in grad school, so very interesting people to look at. Okay, so André Breton, he is a poet, he's a critic, he's a novelist, so he's a writer. He's also a political activist. He's an avid anti-fascist. He writes the First Surrealist Manifesto in 1924. Another manifesto, I told you, 20th century, lots of manifestos. He eventually writes the Second Surrealist Manifesto as well, and he writes quite a lot about Surrealism throughout his career. Okay, the name Surrealism actually comes from the critic Apollinaire, who we talked about when I was talking about Cubism. If you go back to the Cubism lecture, he wrote quite a lot about Cubism as well, and then he coins the term for Surrealism. So he's a very important critic in the avant-garde in the early 20th century in art, visual art development. Breton's manifesto defines Surrealism as pure psychic automatism. Automatism is it's a performance of an action, of basically any action, not just art related, without thinking about it, without conscious thought, without control. It's an automatic action that the idea is that taps into your subconscious and your unconscious mind and gets into the primal nature of who you are. So he defines Surrealism as being very linked with this idea, okay? Surrealism is heavily influenced by two really big things. The first being World War I and all the destruction and chaos that it causes and all the psychological and physical damage it causes, particularly in Europe. The second is Sigmund Freud. Okay, so we've talked quite a lot about World War I and how damaging it was to a lot of the artists and thinkers in Europe. So you can understand, you can kind of cross-reference how that damage would cause an upheaval in a lot of different circles and cause some searching for different areas to focus energies on. And one of them, it makes sense if the world is in chaos and is terrible outside to create a movement in which you're focusing inside and you're focusing on the unconscious instead of the reality that is outside. It makes a lot of sense, right? So Breton says Surrealism is based on the belief in the superior reality of the dream. Surrealism literally means more than real or better than real. Okay, so he's saying that it's based on the dream being superior, and then when we look at the word, we see that the word itself means better than reality. Okay, so this makes a lot of sense when we think about what goes into surrealism. Another prominent influence on the surrealists were the writings of the Marquis de Sade. He's a figure that exists way before them, but his writings are rediscovered around this time by our friend Apollinaire and are made accessible to the public for the first time in quite a long time, right at the advent of surrealism. This is related to the interest in the subconscious and particularly in the unconscious mind and the subconscious drives of the self, of the id. So our friend Freud writes a lot about the ego, the superego, and the id. So the Marquis de Sade was definitely a figure who focused on the id. That's kind of the darker thoughts, the things that we don't generally say out loud. So it has a relationship to psychoanalysis and to the work of Freud, so it makes sense that it would kind of tie in here. Particularly, surrealist artists become interested in giving expression to these aggressive drives that are kind of lurking in the unconscious mind. Breton mentions de Sade in the First Manifesto. Several artists of the time, like Man Ray and Salvador Dali, strive to emulate him in their fictive works, not in real life. He did very bad things to people, particularly women, in real life. So they try to like express some of these things through their artwork, and basically just this interest in free expression of impulses, particularly those that are sexual or violent in nature. So Marquis de Sade is another figure that is very influential, particularly his writings are very influential to the surrealists. The surrealists are also closely linked with Dada, which makes a lot of sense. Many Dadaists join the surrealists and bring with them some of their techniques. Remember, we talked a little bit about how a lot of their techniques, particularly those based on chance and those based on automatic drawing and things like this, were designed because they thought that would tap into the unconscious mind. So those two things kind of make sense, that there would be a link between them, right? Surrealism develops along two main paths. So there's naturalistic surrealism, and then there's biomorphic surrealism. Naturalistic surrealism is basically like you have scenes or figures that look recognizable. They look like actual scenes from life, or could have elements of actual scenes from life, but something is wrong. There's something a little off about them. There's something uncomfortable. So they've it's like something from this reality that's been warped a little bit, so it seems more like it's out of a dream or a nightmare. Biomorphic surrealism relies really heavily on the automatism idea. Okay, so it's more like loose drawing and painting to try and connect with the unconscious mind, to sort of bypass our waking mind to get into the unconscious mind to let it drive creation. So those are the two kind of main forks of surrealism. Another note just on psychoanalysis. So mostly we talk about Freud and his influence in relationship to art, but Freud is not the only important thinker in this field. There are some later people in psychoanalysis that contribute as much or close to as much as Freud and are very influential. If you have an interest in this, Jacques Lacan and also Julia Kristeva are both very influential to artists later. Okay, let's start with naturalistic surrealism, which is probably what most of you think of when you think of surrealism. Okay. Before we go into this, please check out my notes on Degenerate Art, but just to give you kind of a run through of what that is. I don't make a separate slideshow about Degenerate Art because basically it's everything that we're looking at this time. So the German is Entartet Kunst, which is, it literally just means degenerate art. Hitler comes up with this term. You've heard of Adolf Hitler, I'm sure, the leader of the Nazis. So in 1937, he decides that there needs to be an exhibition of degenerate art. He basically believed that 19th century realistic, naturalistic work, painting predominantly, was the height of Aryan artistic achievement. He was big into Aryans, you know. And so that was the best art, and anything that didn't look like that was bad. He wanted to be an artist. Hitler wanted to be an artist, and he was rejected from art school, and so he has sort of a sore spot when it comes to the arts. So part of this is, it almost reads like punitive, like, oh, coming and trying to take control of the arts is like, if I can't be a part of you, then you can't exist, kind of crazy, irrational response. But so basically, he has his guy who's the leader of propaganda and his cultural development, Goebbels. You've probably heard of him. He orders him to go and confiscate 16,000 pieces of artwork from lots of different artists, over 200 different artists. And he says that he needs to round all this art up, and they're going to have a show. And the reason they're going to have a show is to show the public what bad art is, what is bad. And the word degenerate is very specifically selected. This was an adjective used by Nazis to label something inferior. So degenerate was used for all kinds of different people, for people that they thought were racially or ethnically or whatever, inferior in their weird, crazy, warped, evil Nazi brains. So the use of the word degenerate was very purposeful. So he wanted to have this exhibition to make an example of people. It sort of backfires. It's one of the most popular exhibitions of all time. It was up for 4 months and 20,000 people came to see it every day. So it was extremely popular. People really liked the art. But to try and counter that simultaneously, he had a show called Groß Deutsch Kunstausstellung, which is the Great German Art Exhibition, basically. So in this one, he just shows a bunch of work. Hitler and Goebbels choose a bunch of work that they approve of, that's like more traditional, more conservative work, and they're like, this is the good work, that is the bad work. But way more people were interested in seeing the bad work. And degenerate art really targeted avant-garde art in general, but it was particularly hard on surrealists and Dadaists. Okay, so, and a lot of artists were killed. A lot of artists were forced into exile and had to flee. Artists died in concentration death camps. Some artists died by suicide because they didn't want to have their work tainted by this, and they did not want to be sent into a concentration camp, and they felt really hopeless. Ernst Kirchner, who's one of the famous German expressionists we looked at, is one of those artists. So it's a lot of artists destroyed their work. It's a really horrible thing that happened. So I want you to be aware of it. It's an important part of history. Okay, to get back to what we're looking at here, this is a piece by Max Ernst. He's born in 1891. He dies in 1978. He's one of the artists who was originally a Dadaist in Germany, and he is kind of one of the earlier Dadaists to kind of move over into Surrealism. He's very interested in Breton's writing about Surrealism, and you can see this painting was made the same year that Breton's Manifesto was written. Okay, so about Max Ernst. He grew up near Cologne, which is in Germany. He was very imaginative as a child and was kind of an odd kid. He kept this journal from a very young age in which he wrote about his life, but he wrote about his life mostly in the third person, and he created all this weird kind of mythological aspect of his life. So one of the things he said, that his mother laid an egg, that's how he was born, that she laid an egg in an eagle nest, and the eagle looked after him for 7 years, and then he emerged, and then the eagle was his confidant who he consulted with about his ideas. He writes about wanting to be a magician. He consults with the eagle because he wants to find the great myth of his age. He writes that he dies at one point and then is reborn. So it's a very strange, it's a journal, but it's a very like fantasy driven kind of journal. So he has this very wild imagination from a young age. Excuse me. He was very interested from the beginning of his work, even when he was a Dadaist, in achieving a sense of the psychic in his work, as he said. So when he hears about this movement that's focused really on the unconscious and Freud and dreams, he's like, this is perfect. This is what I've been looking for. In 1920, he meets André Breton. In 1922, he moves to Paris, which is where Breton is, so that he can be closer to the Surrealist group. And then in 1922, he paints this work, which has quite a title. It's Two Children Threatened by a Nightingale. The title comes from one of his poems. He sometimes wrote poetry also to accompany his work. Okay, so in this painting, he paints a dream, and the way he paints it is kind of a direct challenge to Renaissance art, to traditional art. So as you can see by looking at it, the background is painted, and is painted in a way that gives regard to linear perspective, to atmospheric perspective. So it's painted in kind of a traditional way, but he challenges this idea that a painting should be like a window onto the real world. He breaks some of the rules, right? So he paints this, and then he creates this little wooden building and little fence and attaches it to the painting so that it breaks the pane, right? So that it breaks through the fourth wall and comes out into our space. And then he puts the title to kind of mess with reality again. If you look under the painting part, he's cut away part of the frame and written the title there. So that also is kind of breaking the relationship between the painting and the museum. Usually you have the label next to it, and he puts it in the painting, so as if the painting itself is aware that it's a painting and what it is. So he's really playing with ideas about perception and about what art is. And this is also something from a dream, which is one of the focuses of Surrealism. So this kind of experimental technique with a dream as a subject matter is very in playing with levels of reality, all very in keeping with Surrealism. Okay, this is Leona Carrington. She's born in 1917 and dies in 2011. She's born in Lancashire, England. Her father was a textile merchant. She was a very rebellious troublemaker of a kid, so her family shipped her off to school in Florence, Italy, which sounds like a pretty good deal to me. And there she attended Ms. Penrose's Academy of Art. So she went to kind of an arts specialty high school. She then goes to Ozenfant Academy of Fine Art in London. So she moves back to London for college. This work is painted in 1939. She first saw Max Ernst's work and kind of fell in love with him because of his work. She really loved his Surrealist paintings and his Dada work. Then she eventually meets him in 1937 at a party in London. And then she leaves London and goes to Paris with him. She falls in love with him. He leaves his wife. They have this very intense relationship where they're both artists and they're both very intense kind of emotional people. And so at that time she starts working in Surrealism. This is her second Surrealist painting. Her first one is a self-portrait that is also sometimes called the Dawn Horse. I think one of you is writing about that. Okay, so she paints this, which is a portrait of Max Ernst. He was quite a bit older than her. And then because, if you look at the date on this, 1939, he has to flee Europe. He keeps getting arrested. He's Jewish. He's also a degenerate artist from Germany. So the Gestapo is after him. So he flees Europe. He flees to New York with the help of Peggy Guggenheim, who's a very famous curator and arts patron and collector. They actually end up getting married. Leona Carrington's heart is broken, and she's spent some time in an asylum, but then she also has to run away from the Nazis. So she flees to Spain. While she's in Spain, she has to get out of Europe because, the Nazis are ruining everything again, just sort of trying to get over World War I, and then here come the Nazis. She marries a Mexican ambassador who whisks her away to Mexico. It was kind of a marriage of convenience. He was trying to help her out, get her out of the country. And then she lives in Mexico off and on for the rest of her life. She really likes it in Mexico. She later spends time in New York. Particularly, she spends most of the 1960s in New York. Okay, so this painting. We have Max Ernst. He is dressed in a kind of bizarre, woolly, snuffleupagus-looking coat that has kind of a mermaid tail attached to it. He's carrying this lamp that has a horse in it. We also see a horse frozen, a white horse frozen in the background. Leona Carrington paints herself as a white horse, or uses a white horse in her paintings as a surrogate for herself. She dreams herself as a white horse sometimes. So this painting sort of infers that maybe she's feeling kind of stuck or frozen or not very good in their relationship. She's feeling a little bit controlled, perhaps, because she's in his hand and the lamp. She's also frozen in the background. Okay, so Ernst rescues this painting when he is fleeing. So he rescues this painting when he goes to New York. He later returns it to her in New York, and she gives it to him. She says, I want you to have this, and he in return gives her his painting, Lenora in the Morning Light, which he painted in 1940. So it's kind of sweet. They give each other their portraits of each other, and then they never see each other again, but they kind of make up as artists. So it's an interesting work because it's her early foray into surrealism. She continues painting as a surrealist for her entire life. She stays kind of in that modality. And that's a lot of surrealists stay true to surrealism. There are surreal painters who self-identify as surrealist painting today. So it's a movement that exists. We think of it as a starting point, but it doesn't exactly stop. It's kind of a continual thing. Okay, I almost didn't put Salvador Dali in this because he's the one everybody knows, and I'm contrary like that. But let's talk about Salvador Dali. Okay, Salvador Dali, he is born in 1904. He dies in 1989. He's the most famous surrealist. He's probably one of the most famous artists of all time. I would wager a guess that most of you have heard of Dali. Maybe some of you have had posters of his work in your room. I feel like he's one of those artists that's reproduced quite a lot. I've assigned one of you his most famous painting, Persistence of Memory. He's extremely influenced by Freud. Let's talk a little bit about Dali's life. He's born in Figueres in Catalonia in northern Spain. I've been there. His Salvador Dali Museum is there. It's pretty wild. He's actually entombed in it. So he's born there. He attends San Fernando Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Madrid. This is the same school that Picasso attended briefly, and then he kind of got disinterested in it and left. But so, good school. Some of the big names of art history have gone there. There he becomes very close to a poet named Federico Garcia Lorca. Lorca is quite an important, famous poet from the time. And they meet essentially because Salvador Dali dressed like a crazy person. He dressed like a very eccentric, old-time sort of dandy. Like he wore ruffled shirts and was very interesting looking. And Lorca thought he was a very interesting character. So he kind of gets into the art and poetry scene there through Lorca. Sadly, Lorca is killed in the beginnings of the Spanish Civil War. Nationalists kidnap him because they thought that his poetry was too political, and they kill him. They shoot him, which is very sad. Okay, when he is living in Madrid, he, like Picasso, goes to the Prado Museum quite often. He actually has a specific time he goes. He goes every Sunday morning, and he would go and take his sketchbook and really study the work by the masters and make reproductions of them. He He experiments with Cubism while he's in school, and that kind of garners the most attention he gets in school. People are pretty amazed that he has such a good grasp of this new conceptual kind of work. He travels to Paris in 1926, and he meets his hero, Picasso. He's also extremely influenced by Yves Tanguy, and the kind of signature Dali style, that kind of smooth look that everything has that feels sort of fluid. That is Yves Tanguy all the way. He even told his nephew, Tanguay's nephew, he made like a crack at one point that says that he kind of ripped off everything from your uncle. Like, so he's aware that he's quite influenced by Tanguy, though Dali is much more famous. Okay. André Breton described Dali's work as the most hallucinatory there ever has been up to now, and that's when he sees his first big show in Paris. In 1929, he meets his lifelong muse, and who is eventually his wife, Gala. In 1931, he paints Persistence of Memory, which one of you is writing about. That's his very famous painting of the melting clocks. It's at the MoMA in New York. He exhibits many times in Paris in the 1930s. His first show in New York City is in 1933, and then he visits New York in 1934, and it's like a huge deal. It's like a big news item that Salvador Dali is in America and is in New York. And the show that year in 1934 is extremely successful critically, and it's very financially successful for him. He sells all his paintings. Unlike most of the surrealists, he tried to remain neutral and apolitical. He did not like to talk about politics. This infuriated Breton and caused Breton to denounce him several times and say that he was basically sympathetic to the Nazis, the fascists. And Dali said, I am not, I have never been, I am not in thought or action sympathetic to them. But he just tried to remain neutral, which is kind of controversial at this time. Artists generally took a stand. This is just a random story of his, but I think it's kind of funny. So he goes to London, he has a show in London, and he's doing an artist talk, and he decides to show up in a very eccentric showmanship Salvador Dali way. So he gets like an old diving suit with one of those big diving bell kind of head things, helmets on it. So he's wearing that, and then he's holding a pool cue in one hand, and then he has the leashes of these two gigantic Irish wolfhounds that are walking ahead of him, and he goes out on the stage, but because of the way the diving bell, the diving suit is set up, he's not getting oxygen through it, so he almost dies. He almost suffocates, and they have to find a screwdriver and unscrew this thing and pull it off of him, and he was like turning blue under it. So he does all these big kind of flashy things, but sometimes he gets quite injured when he tries to do these things. I lost my place. In 1936, he is part of this huge surrealist show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's a pretty big deal. It's a very influential exhibition. During World War II, Dali and Gala, they have to flee to the United States. They split their time for about 8 years between New York and California. In 1946, he makes a film called Destino with Walt Disney. It's a cartoon. It's bizarre. You can find it online. Destino, Dali, Walt Disney, look it up. It's very weird. In 1968, he buys a castle for his wife, like you do. So he buys her a castle in Pubol in Spain, and that is her castle, and he is not allowed to go there unless he gets written permission from her. So they had a very strange, interesting kind of relationship. Gala dies in 1982 and is entombed in her castle, and after that, Dali moves to the castle, and he is crushed. His health suffers, and he's very depressed from this time out after Gala dies. The King of Spain decides to make Dali a noble at this time, and so he creates a position. He's now the Marquis de Dali de Pubol, the Marquis of Dali of Pubol, Spain. And then he dies of heart failure in 1989 at the age of 84. Okay, let's talk about this particular painting. This painting is from what is called his paranoid critical period, where he made a lot of paintings to do with paranoia and other kind of anxieties that he had. He's known for these double images in this period. He has a lot of mirrored images, which is also something that is one of the kind of hallmarks of a lot of surrealist painting. He wrote about the double image method in his 1935 essay, The Conquest of the Irrational. So he writes an essay. People are continually trying to get Salvador Dali to write about his inspiration and his work, and he is always happy to do that, but a lot of times it doesn't make any sense. So people want him to come give artist talks, and he shows up in a diver suit and passes out, and they want him to write about his work, and he writes things like this. So he says, his method is a spontaneous method of irrational understanding based upon the interpretive critical association of delirious phenomena, which means nothing. Okay, I mean, kind of. He's sort of hitting on some things that maybe relate to Freud and maybe relate to psychoanalysis and kind of maybe are something. But he's kind of a performer, you know. He likes to play this character that he's created of himself. And the way that he writes is sort of convoluted. Okay, so in this painting, we have the Catalan landscape where he's from in Spain. And then we have these sort of interesting looking trees that form, and then we have these swan shapes, and then the swans reflected with the trees form elephants. We have these kind of Dali-like clouds in the background. So this is a very typical painting of his. It's kind of what I would call the Dali color palette, which is this sort of fiery, like if you were American, we would maybe call it a southwestern kind of palette, but it's Catalonian. It looks very much like the Catalan landscape from where he's from. So we have these kind of turquoisey blues and these rich oranges going on. Okay, Salvador Dali. This is the other giant of surrealism. This is Frida Kahlo. She's born in 1907. She dies in 1954. And she's interested in art at a very young age. She apprentices with an engraver named Fernando Fernandez, why his parents did that to him, I don't know, but his name was Fernando Fernandez. She does this in 1925. She's in a very bad accident, also in 1925. I believe it's a trolley accident, and she gets very, very badly injured. And it's an injury that kind of derails her life and causes her to have chronic pain throughout her life. She has a lot of different surgeries and treatments for it. But at the time of this injury, she was enrolled in medical school. She was 18, and she was going to go be a doctor, which was quite a thing for a woman at this time period. She's living in Mexico. Did I say that? She's Mexican. She lives in Mexico. So she's in this horrible accident, and she has to drop it. She has to withdraw her application to medical school, basically. So she's unable to walk for 3 months. She's totally bedridden. And her mother remembers that, you know, she's had this talent at a young age for art, but she, you know, had kind of decided that she wanted to go to medical school instead. So her mother's like, oh, maybe you could do medical illustrations or something. So she makes her this special easel that sits over her while she's in her bed, and she gets her drawing materials. Her father buys her some paints. So kind of like Matisse, when Matisse is down with appendicitis, he starts painting while he's recovering. So Frida starts painting, and she does a lot of self-portraits at this time. She set up a mirror next to her bed, so she gets very good at doing these kind of fantastical self-portraits. And of this she said, I paint myself because I am often alone and I am the subject I know best. She then, in 1929, marries painter Diego Rivera. He's quite a famous Mexican painter. He's very nationally well regarded and very well regarded in the United States as well. He's mostly known as a muralist. He's a very famous mural in New York and one in San Francisco. So they get married. André Breton is very taken with her paintings. She meets Diego Rivera, her husband, because they're both members of the Communist Party of Mexico, and she meets him at one of their gatherings. They're actually very involved with international politics. They're very politically active. Let's see. Her first solo show in New York was before her first solo show in Mexico. So she has her first solo exhibition in New York City in 1938. She then shows in Paris in 1939. André Breton helped organize that. He was a huge fan of her work. She was not a fan of him, however. She kind of refused to identify herself with the Surrealists because she thought that they were all kind of a bunch of, she called them cuckoo intellectual crazy people, I think. She wasn't, she didn't love the Surrealists. But from that exhibition in Paris, the Louvre purchased her work, The Frame, in 1939, which makes her the first Mexican artist to have a piece in the Louvre collection, which is a huge deal. Okay, so let's look at this work. The two Fridas, it's her first large-scale work, and it's bigger than she is. She's a very tiny person. She is only like 5 feet tall. Here we see her seated beside herself. There's lots of different interpretations of this work. On the left, she's wearing kind of this European style clothing, and on the right, she is in traditional Tijuana dress. Some people think this represents her dual heritage. Her father was German, and her mother was half Mexican and half Native American. So the more traditionally Mexican-dressed Frida is holding in her hand a little portrait of her husband, Diego Rivera. The more European-looking Frida holds forceps that are kind of pinching off the blood coming from her heart. This was painted the year that she is divorced from Diego Rivera. They're only divorced for a year, and then they remarry each other. They also had a very tumultuous relationship. This is fairly common with artists, I think. So she has this painting that has some emotional content and also showing this feeling of duality that she has. And it also, the forceps pinching off the blood, I mean, a lot of her work alludes to her pain. She's in chronic pain all the time for the rest of her life because of this horrible accident she was in and the subsequent surgeries that were kind of botched. But she's one of the more famous and more well-regarded surrealists ever. So that is Frida. Okay, this is Remedios Varo. She's born in 1908. She dies in 1963. She is also born in Catalonia, Spain, like Salvador Dali. Her full name is Maria de los Remedios Alicia Rodrigo Varo y Oranga. And her mother named her partially the Remedios Varo part after the Virgin of Remedies. So there's in Catholicism, there's different kinds of entities and saints and things that you can pray to. So the Virgin of Remedies is a incantation of the Virgin Mary that is supposed to remedy and heal. So she decides to shorten her name, because that is quite a long name, to Remedios Varo, because it sounds cool. I'm sure she had a more technical reason than that, but Remedios Varo is a pretty cool name. Okay, her dad was a hydraulic engineer, so the family moved around Spain and North Africa quite a lot for his job. He notices that she's very, has an affinity for art at a young age, and he has her in his technical engineering manuals practice copying the technical drawings of hydraulics when she's like a little kid. So she spends a lot of time as a child learning to draw by drawing these really technical mechanical manuals. Her dad also supplements her education by giving her adventure books to read and Edgar Allan Poe's books and poems to read, and then later he gives her books on mysticism and philosophy. So he kind of really believed in her and saw that she had this great imagination and this talent. She attends the Fine Arts Academy in Madrid, which is where Dali and Picasso went. So, like I said, that school has quite a great list of alum. She then moves to Paris in 1930 to be more near the art scene. She escapes World War II by fleeing to Mexico. She considered Surrealism an expressive resting place within the limits of Cubism and as a way of communicating the incommunicable. So she identified as a surrealist, and she saw it as a place to combine a lot of her interests. She talks about her work as being she's very interested in and influenced by Carl Jung, who wrote about dream interpretation. She's also interested in sacred geometry. She's also interested in witchcraft and alchemy and the I Ching. So she has a lot of different interests. And if you look closely at her painting, she pulls in a lot of references from these different interests. But definitely the idea of the dreamscape and the subconscious is something that continually is referenced in her work. In this painting, we see a kind of scientist-artist figure who is portrayed as the persona of knowledge. The figure is portrayed as this owl-human kind of hybrid. And this is a painting that's kind of about the interconnection between science, between art, between myth, between creation, alchemy, nature. So this creature is drawing birds and then exposing them to a triangular prism, which is what Newton used to separate light into the color spectrum. So it's a reference to Newton and science. So to color the piece, it's being exposed to this light, and then the birds come alive and fly off the table. So it's very interesting. This weird double vase thing on the floor definitely looks like some of the medieval illustrations from alchemy books. So there's that reference there. We have where the heart should be, and being worn around the neck, this violin, which is maybe a reference to how music is integrated with art. So she's a super interesting artist, and she is one who incorporates a lot of the greater mythos that feeds into surrealism pretty directly into her work. Okay, let's talk about the other branch of surrealism, biomorphic surrealism. Okay, Paul Klee is born in 1879. He dies in 1940. He is Swiss-German. He's a painter, and he's very innovative in his use of, he uses fantasy images. He uses these really fantastical kind of images, and he really predates the Surrealists. You can see the date on this is 1922, so he's making this kind of work before the First Surrealist Manifesto was written, but he's very influential to the Surrealists and has a lot in common with them. He shunned formal association with the Surrealists or the Dadaists. They both kind of claimed him as their own, and he said, no, I am independent. I do not want to be part of any of your things. But he was interested in discovering humanity's deeper truths through symbols and shapes, which kind of sounds like our friends the symbolists, right? Also kind of sounds like Theosophy and Kandinsky's interest there. He's also interested in Carl Jung, the interpretation of the guy who talks, other than Freud, the other guy who talks about the interpretation of dreams. And he's particularly interested in Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious. And he tries to tap into this collective unconscious, the idea that everybody's unconscious kind of is tied together, and there's this flow of ideas that continues between all of humanity. So he wanted to tap into that through his art. He's also a successful violinist. He's a successful musician. And so, like Kandinsky again, he believes that music and art are connected. He wanted to express the unconscious feelings through form and color and line. And he said, art does not reproduce the visible, it makes visible. So he wasn't interested in mimicry or painting what he saw in the world so much as he was interested in making visible the things from his mind, particularly his unconscious mind. He studied nature. He spent a lot of time out in nature, and he particularly analyzed processes of growth and change. Those were areas that he was very interested in. And when he was making work, he would let the pencil or the brush lead him until the idea emerged. So this idea of automatic drawing that comes out of Dadaism is something that he definitely embraces. And if you remember, that's kind of the key point of biomorphic surrealism, is that the automatism is the main mechanism by which the art is made. Another artist of this time who is very in keeping with those ideas is Miro. He is born in 1893 and he dies in 1983. He also used a process that was reliant on free association and on the unconscious mind, like Paul Klee. He was very influenced by Paul Klee. And he had these kind of ideations when he was pretty young, but he was trying to be practical. And so he goes to business school and he's trying to do art on one side and then go to business school on the other. And he has a total nervous breakdown. So after that, he decides it is just art for him, no more trying to be someone he is not, and he is much happier. He was an adamant admirer of Van Gogh and also of Cezanne. He went to La Lotja Fine Art Academy in 1907. In 1920, he moves to Paris to be closer to where the scene is, the art scene. He started his works with making these kind of little doodles with pen or pencil, usually pen, and then he would build off of the work from there. So he'd lay down these kind of automatic things, and then he'd build the work from that. He talked about his work being half unconscious and half conscious. So he would say, rather than setting out to paint something, I begin painting, and as I paint, the picture begins to assert itself under my brush. The first stage is free unconscious. The second is calculated. So he creates something, and then from that, he fills in the form and finishes the piece intentionally, purposefully. So it's a little bit different than Paul Klee. He does say that it's kind of a back and forth, unconscious, conscious kind of effort. He also shunned association. He did not want to be called a surrealist. At first, I think he later actually does decide that he's okay with that, but at first he did not like that association. Okay, the last person we're going to talk about is Arashel Gorky. Arashel Gorky is born in 1904 and dies in 1948. He's an Armenian-American artist. He was born in Armenia, and he has to flee the Armenian genocide of 1915. And it's horrible. Almost his entire family is killed. He flees with his mother. They get separated. She ends up starving to death. I mean, he has one of the most tragic lives in the history of people, I think. He has a really horrible, tragic life. So he flees in 1915. He eventually arrives in America in 1920. He then attends the New School of Design in Boston. He eventually ends up teaching there. He mostly lives in New York. He spends a lot of time in New York. And he said, "The stuff of thought is the seed of the artist. Dreams form the bristles of the artist's brush. I communicate my innermost perceptions through the art, my worldview." And then he gained some success. He has some pretty successful shows in New York. And then a series of terrible things happen to him. He's in a bad accident. Well, no, first he has cancer and has to have a colonoscopy and have all this stuff done to him. He survives that. Then he's in a bad accident, which leaves him partially paralyzed where he can't use his arms, so he can't paint anymore. Then his wife leaves him and takes the kids. Then his studio and his house burn down. And then he ends up dying by suicide. I mean, he just has just horrible things happen to this poor man. The reason that I put him here and like to end surrealism with him is because he was also interested in the same kinds of things as Klee and Miro, and he did these kind of automatic paintings. He, however, would often start them from a fixed color palette. So, for example, this one, he's kind of reminiscing. He has a lot of nostalgia in his paintings for his childhood in Armenia. So he's reminiscing on this palette from the scene he remembers. So he's going back into his mind, and then he's making it dreamier and doing this kind of automatic painting of it. But the way he uses his paint is so much looser. If you look at the brushwork compared to Klee, compared to Miro, he has this much looser fluidity to the way he's applying his paint and overlapping the colors. And why he's super, super important is because he kind of has a foot in two different camps, and the first foot is in surrealism, particularly these biomorphic ideas about painting and about surrealism, and the second is leading into abstract expressionism. He was one of the artists who was kind of a precursor to abstract expressionism and was extremely influential to that group of artists, who are mostly focused in New York, and he kind of hung around with them, and we'll talk about that later. But he's a good bridge between these two major movements in the 20th century. We have surrealism and abstract expression. Well, there's a lot of important movements, but he's an interesting connection between two of these major movements, surrealism and abstract expressionism. So I think he is a good place to end our surrealism lecture. Please do check out the notes. There's a lot more information about degenerate art and some more information about surrealism there. Okay.